Okay, welcome to the second training in a series of workshops that the Office of Water Resources is offering regarding the new freshwater wetland rules that become effective July 1st of this year. My name is Eric Beck. I'm the Administrator of Groundwater and Freshwater Wetlands Protection in the Office of Water Resources. Presenting today will be Susan Kiernan, Deputy Administrator, Office of Water Resources, James Boyd, Deputy Director of CMC, Charles Horbett, Deputy Administrator of the Office of Water Resources. The target audience for these workshops are those involved in preparing wetland applications with an emphasis on the new terminology, identifying buffer zones, applying new buffer standards, and new applications. This is the second of 3 planned workshops. The tentative date for the third workshop is March 30th. Additional details and the agenda will be posted to our website in advance. This and subsequent workshops will be recorded and posted to our website. You'll hear more about that from Sean McCormick coming up. The first workshop we had over 200 attendees, and we received 21 completed survey evaluation responses. Like to see more folks fill out that survey. We use that survey to get feedback in terms of what the topics are that you want to hear about, and that will definitely shape future workshops. Some of the comments that we received, some of the topics from that evaluation, we're making workshop materials available, more training on buffer zones and buffers with an emphasis on procedures, tools, more training on vernal pools and the infill standard, and more annotated examples. We also received suggestions for improvements to our online mapping tools and RIDEM coverages, application types and processes, and a more detailed application training with example site plans, including those regarding the general permit application, and an in-depth discussion of new or amended exemptions. We also received quite a few questions during the presentation itself through our chat function, and also through our online form being used to collect questions and answers. And we're using that to develop frequently asked question fact sheet series that will be posted to our website. The goal of this workshop is to introduce guidance and tools and to obtain feedback and capture frequently asked questions to help us finalize and publish this guidance in the new applications in late April 22 in advance of the effective date of the new rules. I'd like to review the agenda at this time. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, does that look good? Can everyone see the agenda now? It looks like they can. Good. Okay. The workshop will run from 3 to 4:30 today. We're starting with this welcome, and then Sean McCormick will go over the protocols for the meeting. And then we'll have an update from Sue Kiernan and James Boyd on rulemaking updates for both agencies. And then Chuck Horbett will deliver the bulk of the presentation on navigating the new rules with subtopics, permitting framework and standards overview, application types, and application content. After each one of those, we'll have a time for question and answers. Sean McCormick will go through and explain to you how we'll use that Q&A function of this webinar to collect your questions. And we'll use these times in the agenda to answer those. And then we'll also have some time at the end after next steps if there are additional questions you need to answer. And now I'll turn it over to Sean McCormick to give you some rules of the game.
Thank you, Eric, and welcome everybody. So for this workshop, we've transitioned from a Zoom meeting to a Zoom webinar. And most of the functionality remains the same. The primary difference is that we now have a dedicated question and answer module. And so if you hover over the bottom bar on your Zoom screen, you should see a Q&A with two little chat boxes. We're asking everyone who would like to submit a question to use that. It provides a little better functionality in terms of managing the questions and making sure that none fall through. And we're going to be managing those questions in a couple different ways. Some of them will be responding to with a typed answer. Some of them we will have the presenters respond to during the Q&A session. And then at the end, much like we did last time, we're going to do a roundup of any questions that were not answered during the presentations and do our best to answer all the questions that are asked. However, if for some reason there are any questions that are not addressed in the workshop, please submit them to our question and answer system. I'm going to put up the link for that and a couple other things in just a moment. We're using that system to be able to capture and organize all the questions that come in so that we can identify patterns in different topics that have more questions and try to guide our guidance documents and other things towards answering and taking care of some of those questions that have popped up. The next thing, I'm going to share my screen for a moment, is that we have the new websites are now up and running. We're very excited to announce. So the first website that I'm on now is a revamped version of the new Freshwater Wetlands rules site that had previously existed. It's been reorganized to really try to prioritize some of the important updates and key information up top. And then there's some rulemaking updates and some information about the previous versions of the rules and those rulemaking actions towards the bottom of the page. And there's now this orange button that will bring you to the brand new Wetlands Rules Training and Guidance Materials page. This is going to be the clearinghouse for all of the guidance documents, recordings, and PowerPoint presentation slideshows. And so you can see we're going to continuously update the schedule of upcoming workshops, and we'll have links for registration added when the time is appropriate. And then we will continue to add to our archives with the presentation slides and with a video recording of the presentation itself. And then down towards the bottom is where we're going to be placing the guidance documents and outreach materials. Some of them are already there, and you could see with the areas that are marked coming soon, those are the placeholders for things that we're hopefully going to have up and running shortly. And then finally, the other link that I'm going to post shortly is for our evaluation survey. And I know last time we posted it up right at the end. So we're going to post it now and then again towards the end so that folks will have an opportunity to click that link and access the survey.
Thank you, Sean. Now I'd like to introduce Sue Kiernan, Deputy Director, Office of Water Resources, to give us an update on rulemaking.
Thanks, Eric. This will be relatively brief. DEM, as we mentioned at the last training workshop, we had undertaken rulemaking to repeal what are referred to as the Part 2 rules and regulations governing the administration and enforcement of the Freshwater Wetlands Act. They're referred to as 250-RIRC-150-15-2. That public comment period on that repeal action closed on February 18th, this month, and we are proceeding to finalize the repeal of those rules, and they will shortly become inactive. The current rules, which are referred to as the Part 1 rules, or 250-RICR-150-15-1, they remain in place until July 1st. We have also issued from DEM public notice recently of rulemaking, which occurred on February 18th as well, for amendments to the rules and regulations establishing the minimum standards relating to location, design, construction, and maintenance of on-site wastewater treatment systems. Those rules are referred to as 250-RICR-150-10-6. And the purpose of that rulemaking was to update what are referred to as our outs rules to accommodate the changes in definitions and terminology that occurred in the Freshwater Wetlands Act, and to align those two sets of regulations. The public comment period for that closes on March 21st, later this in a few weeks, and we expect to then take action to make those changes effective at July 1st in concert with the other new freshwater wetland rules also taking effect. So that's the update from DEM on rulemaking. Thank you.
Very good, Sue. Good afternoon, everyone, and a quick update from the CRMC. The Coastal Resources Management Council has also adopted new freshwater wetland rules in the vicinity of the coast, known under the Rhode Island Code of Regulations as 650-RICR-20-00-9. As DEM has done, our new freshwater wetland rules will be effective on July the 1st of this year. Our current rules are the same RCRA code, but Part 2, and those are the present rules. And just last week, the CRMC issued a public notice for a repeal of Part 2 of our rules and regulations. And the comment period runs until March 24th, and the CRMC will hold a public hearing on Tuesday, March the 8th at 6 p.m. And this will be in Providence, live and in person at the Department of Administration building. And again, this will be a public hearing to hear comment on the repeal of the current freshwater wetland rules. And that repeal will be effective on July 1st, when the new freshwater wetland rules, Part 9, will be effective. So that public notice, by the way, if you have not seen it, is posted on the Secretary of State's website, as well as on the CRMC's website at www.crmc.ri.gov. And that is the CRMC update. Thank you both, Eric and Sue.
Thank you, Jim. Now I'd like to introduce Chuck Corbett, the Deputy Administrator in the Office of Water Resources. And Chuck is going to queue up the presentation and share a screen with us. And take it away, Chuck.
Thank you, Eric. Welcome, everybody, and to your feature presentation. So today we're going to kind of give you a better idea of the permitting framework, how the rules are kind of laid out, and what the main features are, particularly for proposed projects. So some of the things we're going to talk about today, I'm going to give an overview of the new section on the standards that are in the rules, some of which we talked about in the last webinar. I'm going to go over the application types, particularly some of the ones that might have changed or the terminology has changed. And we're going to just dip our toes in the application content section, because honestly, not a lot has changed as far as what we're going to expect for application content. But where it has changed, that's something I'll definitely talk about today. So these are kind of the things that we're going over, and the particular rules I'm going to be talking about. Rule 3.7, that is where all of our standards are or have been put in the new rules, including the freshwater wetlands and buffer standards, as well as a lot of other standards. It's where our review criteria are, and as in all the descriptions of variances, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. We'll talk a little bit about the application types, many of which are described in 3.8.1. We're not going to go over too much on the application forms in this submission. That's probably going to be for a later workshop. Nothing's changed with signatures, but I am going to touch upon some of the things that are going to change with some of the information we need to see now on site plans. All right. So rule 3.7, this is kind of where we have consolidated all of our standards and criteria into one section of the regulations. And because we are now including standards, that has allowed us to kind of create a simpler and more predictable permitting option for certain projects. And because we're kind of putting them in the format of a standard, we had to somehow offer a variance process if you cannot meet all of those standards. So I'm going to be talking about that. And that is also included in this one section. So this rule 3.7 really sets up the foundation for the whole permitting framework and how DEM is going to be reviewing and receiving permits for projects in the freshwater wetlands program. So I'm going to touch on each of the standards. I'm going to focus on any of the differences that are as compared to the current rules. And the first one we're going to go over is the first standard, which is the General Freshwater Wetlands Protection Standard. Certainly the whole Freshwater Wetlands Act and the rules are aimed at protecting freshwater wetlands. And it has always been our goal to avoid or minimize impacts to those freshwater wetlands as much as possible. So this is the first standard, and the standard is come up with a design that completely avoids any physical encroachment into those freshwater wetlands. So that's really the first standard. What's changed here in the rules is the definition of freshwater wetlands. And we talked a little bit about this in our last webinar. The new definition does not include riverbank wetlands or permanent wetlands. Those were those are now under the current rules, what we consider to be the upland areas adjacent to wetlands. But under the law in effect at that time and under these rules, those were called freshwater wetlands. We no longer call those areas freshwater wetlands. They're all considered to be buffer zones. We also introduced the term vernal pool, which had never been in the definition of freshwater wetlands. But that's not really new other than the new terminology. We've always regulated these areas as wetlands. We just, under the current rules, call them special aquatic sites. The next standard is the Freshwater Wetlands Buffer Standard. Now, this is the standard that I talked at length about the last time. So I'm really only going to touch upon the highlights of those of this buffer standard. And if you missed the last webinar, we do have that on the website that Sean just showed you. You can go back and watch that. I really go into a lot of detail about it. So in order to meet the freshwater wetlands buffer standard, the first thing you need to do is determine what the buffer zone is applicable to the project, which, you know, is a process. Once you've determined what that buffer zone is, then the standard is to avoid any physical alteration of that buffer, including any buffer that might be required to be created. And again, as we discussed in that last webinar, there are only limited circumstances in which we may require an applicant to restore or create additional buffer. And finally, there are some flexibility in reduced buffer standards when you're on infill lot, which is specifically defined in its limited circumstances. But when for an infill lot, you cannot meet the buffer standard, there is this reduced standard in there. And that is all, again, covered in this 3.7.1b. The next standard is the setback standard, which is new. We've never really had a setback standard in the past. We've informally had an unwritten standard of 10 feet, right, from between a limit of disturbance and a primary structure, maybe reduced to 5 feet for things like sheds and fences. So now we will have a setback standard. So for primary structures, that's going to be no less than the buffer width plus 20 feet. And for accessory structures, and this is things like sheds, decks, patios, fences, that setback will be no less than the buffer width plus 5 feet. The legislation that kind of precipitated this change in the wetland rules also required DEM to look at its out setbacks. And we did, and nothing has really changed with the outs rules as far as setbacks for various components of a wastewater treatment system from a wetland feature. However, you do need to be aware that even if you may meet the out setback standards from these resources, in order to meet the buffer standard, you need to be sure that your proposed leach field and the 10 feet cleared area that is supposed to be maintained around that leach field is outside of the new wetland buffer. So in some cases, in many cases, probably that wetland buffer may require an out system to be located even further away from a wetland than may be allowed under the out rules as a standalone. So this slide kind of goes a little bit over what the setback is going to look like. So on the left, we have an example where the entirety of what has been designated as a buffer zone is in fact buffer. There's no development within that area. So where it says buffer plus 20 feet, you go from the buffer edge, which is kind of this dotted blue line here, an additional 20 feet, which is where I put this purple dotted line here. So long as your primary structure is outside of that, then you will have met the standard. In the one on the left, some of the designated buffer zone is in fact developed. It's got some pavement and clearing that has occurred into this green area, which is the buffer zone, which means that it's not all buffer. And when you're determining what the setback is, which is that distance in addition to the buffer, you'll go out to the edge of what's considered buffer, which is out here somewhere, plus 20 feet. So this is that purple dotted line. So that purple dotted line actually might occur within the buffer zone in some cases, where although in this particular example on the left-hand side of that example, you'll see that all of the buffer zone is in fact buffer. So that purple line is in fact outside the buffer zone. So hopefully that kind of gives you a clear picture of what we're talking about when we're talking about a setback being the buffer, not the buffer zone, but the buffer plus 20 feet. So other standards in the rules, the requirements to address all these items have always been in the rules. They just have not been in the form of standards. And really they're kind of scattered held to breakfast all over the rules. And you had to go from section to section of the rules to kind of figure out what you're supposed to comply with. And in coming up with these standards and turning them into standards, really what we did in most cases is we went to our review criteria. These are the review criteria that all applicants have to show that they've met in order to get a permit. So we've kind of distilled those down into these standards. So the rare and endangered species standard, flood protection standard, these all come from the review criteria. In the review criteria, which are in this rule 3.7.2, haven't changed other than in terminology. And again, I will say that again in a later slide. But for now, I do want to go just real quickly through each of these last standards and talk a bit about that. The rare and endangered species standard, again, like I said, it's derived directly from our review criteria, and the wording within that rule comes right from the review criteria that a project cannot degrade the natural characteristics of a wetland type, or cannot reduce the ability of a wetland or a buffer to ensure the long-term viability of any rare or endangered species. We do have lists in the incorporated materials section of our rules, which is that 3.3A and B. We will be posting those lists so that they are available, and we are going to be working to not only update those lists, but making access to this information easier for applicants, because they are obviously going to need to know this information in order to meet this standard, and in some cases, the buffer standard. The flood protection standard basically is no net reduction in flood storage volume, or no reduction in the rate that flood waters are stored, or no encroachment into floodway, and certainly no obstruction of floodway in that area. Again, derived from our review criteria. It doesn't mean that you have to stay out of floodplain, which is unlike the buffer standard where you have to stay out of the buffer. You can go into floodplain and fill floodplain. You just need to balance it out so that there's no net loss in flood storage. And that's what the standard is saying. The surface and groundwater diversion standard, this is dealing with things like proposed wells that might withdraw groundwater and divert that away from a wetland or a river or stream. Or if you're working within an area subject to storm flowage or an area subject to flooding, this standard basically says that you can obstruct or reduce the storage capacity of any of those. You can still work in those areas. Like, for example, you could go into an area subject to storm flowage and even redirect it. And so long as you're not obstructing it or reducing its flow capacity, you would meet this standard in order to be able to go ahead and do that. The stormwater management and erosion control standards, which are G and H under that rule 3.7.1, those, particularly if you're a consulting engineer, you're very familiar with these. These are all of our stormwater standards. So all we say here is that projects need to meet the minimum standards of the Rhode Island Design and Installation rules. Or if you're a single family house on an individual lot, then we do have the stormwater guidance for that type of development, and that would be the standard in order to meet this particular standard. And just really obviously, projects must prevent erosion and sedimentation, which is being consistent with the Rhode Island Soil Erosion Sediment Control Handbook. And the final standard, which brings in the water quality rules into the wetland standards, which they were always there. This is just kind of putting it up front and center. The standards are going to be that projects cannot contribute to the violation of the state water quality standards, which are put in those water quality rules. And they cannot contribute to significant degradation of any surface water or groundwater, which again is wording from the water quality rules and the groundwater rules. Now, I've mentioned the review criteria a couple times as I've gone through these. And those are taken right from the existing rules. All those review criteria are in our current rules. They're all going to be in the new rules. Most of the revisions that have occurred in the review criteria are just minor changes to update terminology, where we got rid of permanent wetland and riverbank wetland, turned them into buffers, buffer zones. Those terminologies in those phrases are really the only changes in the review criteria. The basic review criteria, what an applicant needs to do in order to get a permit, has not changed. So, and this is kind of a big, really the big change in the rules that I'm talking about is these standards in combination the review criteria. What we're basically doing is, if you are designing a project and you meet all of the standards that I've just gone over, we are going to assume that the review criteria have been met. You don't have to individually justify how you've met each of the review criteria to us. You also don't need to do an impact avoidance and minimization statement, because again, if you meet all of our standards, we're going to assume that impact avoidance and minimization has been met. You meet all the review criteria, you're going to get a permit. So it should be, and it's anticipated to be a very straightforward review process for projects that meet all of those review criteria. Realistically, you're not going to be able to meet all the standards, right? We recognize that it's going to happen pretty often that at least one of these standards are not going to be able to be met. And we understand that. And really, that's what our review process is all about, is to determine whether or not a project that doesn't meet the standards can still be permitted because it happens to meet all of our review criteria and is not resulting in detrimental alterations to freshwater wetlands. So this is why we created the variance process. And a variance is required when certain standards cannot be met. That's basically the bottom line. You cannot meet a variance, you cannot receive a variance for 3 of the standards. So those last 3 that I went over, the stormwater management standard, the erosion and sediment control standard, and the water quality standard, you cannot get a variance for those. You can get a variance for any of the other standards, but those 3 you cannot. And it doesn't seem to really make sense because, you know, how can you get a permit if you can't get a variance from the standards? But to explain it a little bit, taking the stormwater management standard, that standard itself already has built into it a process by which an applicant can get a waiver from certain of the stormwater minimum standards, right? Or you design a project. For example, one of the stormwater standards is a infiltration standard, the groundwater recharge standard. There are lots out there you cannot meet that standard, either because of high groundwater or because of ledge. But you can design it to meet as much of that standard as you can to the maximum extent practicable. That is still meeting the stormwater management standard, even though you're not exactly meeting that standard. So that's why under these wetland rules, you don't get a variance from the stormwater management standard because it's already cooked into the process. Not so much the erosion sediment control standard. Basically what that says is you need to design your project to prevent erosion and, even more importantly, prevent sedimentation from getting into a freshwater wetland resource. Quite simply, the department is not going to allow you to get a variance in order to allow sediment to get into a wetland, unless you're actually proposing fill in a wetland, which is a variance to the wetland standard, the freshwater wetland standard. You're not going to get a variance for that. You're not going to say, oh yeah, okay, you know, you want a little bit sediment run off your site and into the stream, sure, you know, we'll give you a variance for that. That's not going to happen. So that's why we don't allow a variance for the standard. And the same thing for the water quality standards. To some extent, there is in our water quality rules wiggle room for how much you meet that standard. But the bottom line, or the basic premise of those water quality standards, is that a project cannot impact the designated uses established under the water quality standards. And then again, water quality standards are pretty important. That's something that we will not allow to get a variance for. You just need to meet those standards. For all the other standards, if you need to get a variance, there are going to be 6 requirements for getting those variances, unless you're a public and governmental body. And I will briefly go over some of those as well. There are also some local zoning ramifications, which are pretty important, and I will again go into a lot more detail about those. And some of the requirements in order to get a variance are really taken from CRMC variance procedures. So many of you designers and applicants, if you've had to go to CRMC under the coastal program in order to get a permit, you're very familiar with having to get a variance and what the criteria are. When we developed this variance process, we took a lot of the language that CRMC uses and put it into our rules in order to get variances, just to be consistent, because everybody is familiar with it, everybody's used to that, and we are consistent across the 2 agencies. So the 6 variance requirements, and let me say right now, I'm just going to touch upon these. We do anticipate that, again, because this is a pretty big change, kind of like the buffer change, we're going to devote a specific workshop to this particular issue in the rules. But for now, I just want to throw out what the requirements are for getting a variance. In the first 2, this 3.7.3 A2 and A3 are familiar to everybody. You know, if you can't meet a standard, then in order to get a variance, you need to show that you've met impact avoidance and minimization requirements. Same impact avoidance and minimization requirements that we have under our current rules. So very familiar ground, both for our staff and for designers that have worked with our program for a long time. It also requires that you meet all the review criteria. And that's kind of an obvious one, right? You know, if we're going to give you a variance, we want to make sure that when you're designing a project, you've met all the review criteria in order to get a permit. So that's in there. The remaining 4 that are on this slide are the things that have been taken from CRMC. So you need to show that if you can't meet the standard, maybe it's because the site conditions are not allowing you to meet the standard. Maybe this ledge that is making you have to locate a structure within the setback, for example. The relief requested is the minimum needed for a reasonable use of the property. You don't get to ask for a variance for your pie in the sky project. You get the minimum variance needed for reasonable use of the property. You cannot, the variance request cannot be because of prior action of the applicant, and meeting the standard would cause, and you need to show that meeting the standard would cause undue hardship in order to get that variance. So all these 6 criteria, and again, we're going to go over these in a lot more exhaustive detail than I'm going in tonight at a future training. So this is the 6 variance requirements for all of us, right? Unless you are a government agency or unless you're a public body. So if you are a government or a public agency, then 3 of these go away. Those last 4, those last 3 there, 4, 5, and 6. And we add another one. So you still need to do impact avoidance minimization. You still need to meet all of the review criteria. If you're asking for a variance, then it needs to be because that you cannot meet them because of some kind of site conditions. And the project has to serve a necessary public purpose that provides benefits to the public. So those are the 4 criteria to get a variance if it's a public project being proposed by a public or governmental body. What is a public or governmental body? Some of them are obvious. The state, cities and towns are governmental bodies. The federal government is a governmental body. Quasi-public agencies such as Around Airport Corporation, or public utilities such as Narragansett Electric. Those would be public bodies that this variance criteria would apply to. All right, so I did mention something about these local zoning requirements. And this is something that we've always advised applicants to do before they come to us. Especially if they're going to have a project that's resulting in encroachment either into wetlands or into permanent wetland or riverbank wetland under our current rules. We ask them to go to the zoning boards of the municipalities and try to get a variance from the municipality. Usually, not always, but usually this is from the front yard variance, so that it can put a structure closer to the street in order to reduce some of the encroachment on the back. So it's always been a suggestion, now it's a requirement. So if you cannot meet the standards, and again, this mostly is going to apply to the buffer standard or the setback standard, but you might be able to meet them, or at least reduce how much of a variance you need to ask for. If you got a variance from the municipality, then you need to try to do that. You are required to attempt to get a variance from the municipality before you apply to Rhode Island DEM. So that's a pretty important change and something to keep in mind if you're proposing a project that cannot meet the standards, but might be able to meet the standards, or might require less of a variance if you are able to get a variance of setbacks or some other municipal requirement. So this is a good spot to stop and see if there are any questions on what I've gone over before, and also a good point for me to take a drink. And I guarantee you that this is not Russian vodka.
Hi, Chuck. We don't have any unanswered questions at this time.
Oh, great. Great.
Yep.
I guess my team of people have been answering the questions on the Q&A themselves, or did we not get any?
We did receive one question on a standard. And it was posed by Igor Rungi. And I believe Jim wanted to answer that live. So Jim, go ahead. You're up.
All right, thank you, Eric. And I did post that response in writing as well. But in the case, if you're within CRMC jurisdiction and you have a project that has a direct discharge of tidal waters, under this flood standard, you're not required to have flood storage capacity because the downstream impact is into tidal waters of the state. You're not going to be impacting downstream properties as if you were on a river system located, hundreds of yards, if not miles upstream, and could potentially cause downstream flooding if you didn't address the flood storage standard. So again, within the Red Book, under our stormwater section, we do have that provision where, and actually I will read it, says applicants may not be required to control post-development peak discharge rates at pre-development peak discharge rates, provided the project design provides for non-erosive stormwater discharges to tidal waters. And we extend that also in practice to flood storage capacity if the project has a direct discharge to tidal waters.
Okay, thanks, Jim. We did have another question come in while you were talking. Regarding town zoning variances, there are times when the requested front setback relief is excessive, but the applicant insists RIDEM or CRMC requires it. If the zoning board were to give partial setback relief, would that doom the project?
If they were to give like only partial relief instead of full relief, is that kind of like how I'm understanding the question?
Yes.
Yeah, Chuck, let me just jump in because we've got a lot of experience with that,
Yeah.
that standard. So under the variance standards here, if you're required, if you need a variance to a standard that could potentially be alleviated if you were to get relief from the local zoning authority, that is the requirement under this standard. And for those of you who practice with CRMC coastal applications, that's been a longstanding practice in our program. The fact is you have to demonstrate that you've at least made the attempt to get zoning relief. If they don't grant it, you bring that back to the agency as part of your application, and so be it. We'll have to work around that standard. But if, again, the idea being that if the municipality will provide that local zoning relief as part of your application, then that would obviate the need for getting a variance to the standard in these freshwater wetland rules. That is the preferred route. You just have to demonstrate that you've made a good faith effort to obtain that variance, and whether it is or is not granted by the municipality, you'll have documentation of such.
Exactly. So if you came into the agency, either agency, with an application and you're asking for a variance, say from the buffer standard, and we look at your project and we see that you are meeting the current municipal front yard zoning setback standard, the first thing we're going to look for is whether or not you've provided documentation to show that you have attempted to get relief from that from the town. And if it's not there, then you haven't met the requirement to get a variance. So that's why we put it up front. You need to go to the town first. You may not get it, which is fine, but you need to at least make that attempt, just like Jim said. Anything else, Sarah?
Yep, we've got one more, and then maybe we'll move on.
Okay.
It says, does protection of rare, threatened, and endangered species in the new wetland rules extend to species that do not utilize wetland habitats?
Good question. So potentially, but only if the rare species in question might rely upon wetlands for some part of the life cycle. And if you look at the standard, it isn't really protecting the species, it's protecting the wetland's ability to support or provide habitat requirements for that species. If it's a rare species that is entirely an upland species and does not rely upon the wetland for any part of its life cycle, then no, that would probably not receive any protection under our freshwater wetlands rules. Okay, so we're going to, we're going to move on. And if there are any other questions that come up in the chat, we'll pick them up later on, I'm sure. So the next thing I'm going to go over are some of the new permit application types and some of the nomenclature, the terminology that has probably changed. So this first one is a general permit. And this is brand new. I'm sure everybody is waiting to see what we're going to come up with as far as a general permit goes. And this is, again, one of those things that we're going to go into more detail on a general permit specific workshop. But for now, just know that this Rule 3.10 does provide the department the ability to issue a general permit for common project types that have limited risk for impacts to wetlands. As we're currently anticipating them to be, they're only going to be allowed for projects which are less than an acre of land disturbance, because over an acre land disturbance, it brings in other particular requirements, even outside the wetlands rules for RIPDs, the Rhode Island Point Discharge Elimination System construction general permit. So we wanted to limit it to be less than an acre. And we're looking at things like, these are just examples, individual residential construction, some accessory structure construction, very limited projects associated with existing developed properties, new development that's occurring outside of designated buffer zones. So these are projects that might be within the jurisdictional area and therefore need a permit, but they don't encroach into buffer zone. We're offering potentially a new general permit to take care of those types of projects. And stormwater retrofit projects, which we're seeing more and more of these days. There's certainly a focus on trying to treat a lot of that untreated impervious surfaces that we have throughout the state, to not only protect water quality, but kind of turn back the clock and maybe improve some of the water quality that we have for our waters in the state. Other new permit application types. This application for a freshwater wetlands permit. This is kind of the replacement for what we currently call a request for preliminary determination. So if you've operated under our current rules, you know very much what a request for preliminary determination is. Well, now it's an application for freshwater wetlands permit. And there are kind of two flavors for an application for a freshwater wetlands permit. In many cases, or in some cases, we hope many cases, you got to come to us for a permit, but you're going to meet all of our standards that we just talked about. So you don't need an avoidance minimization narrative. You don't need to tell us how you met all of our review criteria. You just need to show us how did you meet all of the standards. And if you do, you're going to get a permit. If you don't meet the standards, it doesn't mean that you can't get a permit under this application process. It just means you need to get a variance. And the process for getting the variance is meeting the review criteria, doing a proper impact avoidance and minimization statements in giving us that narrative. And it's going to be very similar to what we have under our current request for preliminary determination. Really, the only difference in the review process between what we do now and what we do under an application for freshwater wetlands permit with a variance is you got to meet those additional 4 variance criteria in addition to the review criteria and the impact avoidance minimization. Other than that, you're talking about the same animal. Application for a significant alteration. That is the equivalent to what we now call the application to alter a freshwater wetland. We're assuming, you would assume that if you're coming in for a significant alteration, you don't meet the standards, or you don't meet at least one of the standards. There is no cases of this application type where you meet all of the standards. Otherwise, you get a permit. Process-wise, again, other than the need to meet all of those variance criteria, it's going to be the exact same process in order to get a significant alteration permit. And the request for determination of the presence of jurisdictional area. This is equivalent to our request to determine the presence of wetlands. And again, this gets back to the fact that perimeter wetlands and riverbank wetlands are no longer considered to be wetlands. They are they've been changed to buffers and buffer zones, which are all in this envelope of jurisdictional areas. So when you come into us for an application, or if you come into us with a request to determine the presence of jurisdictional area, what you're going to get back from us is a number of things. Number one, are there any freshwater wetlands on or near the property? And if there are, at that time, we're also going to determine what the jurisdictional area limit is, that upland limit, which is either 100 feet from any freshwater wetland or 200 feet from any flowing body of water. We're also going to give you a determination of what the assigned buffer zone is going to be. So if you remember from the last training when we talked about buffers and buffer zones and how to figure all that out, you can submit a request to determine the presence of jurisdictional area and have us figure it out for you. So that's what this application process is right here. The rest of the application types, which are all outlined in Rule 3.8.1, none of those have really changed. We're still going to verify wetland edges when you ask us to. Although, again, same type of thing. If we issue a verification of the wetland edge, we will also let you know what the assigned buffer zones are going to be. The request for regulatory applicability, emergency alterations, renewals, modifications, transfers, none of that has changed. They're all going to be the same application type. They're all going to follow the same process that we do under the current rules and regulations. Same thing for applications related to farmers, except that under the law that got passed, farmers, if you meet the definition of a farmer, which doesn't necessarily mean that if I farm, I'm a farmer. If you meet the definition of a farmer, then for farming projects, farmers are not subject to the new wetland jurisdictional areas. They are still operating under the old construct of swamps, ponds, marshes, bogs, 50-foot permanent wetland, 100-foot or 200-foot riverbank wetland. None of that changes for farmers. So this afternoon, I'm going to focus on what the various permitting pathways are for these proposed projects. So I'm going to take the application types, the application for, I'm not even going to go, well, I'm going to go over specific applications, but I kind of want to lay out the permitting pathways and how you would go, or what your options are for getting approval or authorization for a proposed project. I'm going to start at the easiest and work my way up to a more complicated project that may be altering into freshwater wetlands. So I'm going to start throwing a bunch of flow charts up at you, but I will summarize each one of them. So in this first pathway flow chart, what this is basically describing here, and what it says is that if a project is in a jurisdictional area, I'm on my wrong note. So this chart is going to describe a situation for a project that is outside the jurisdictional area or is exempt. So if you're outside the jurisdictional area, unless you have to be a project which is identified in this rule 3.5.6b, and just to touch upon those projects, there are certain projects outside the jurisdictional area, either because of their size or because of the nature of their project, that still require a permit. Things like large capacity groundwater wells, large areas of new impervious surface that may be discharging towards a wetland. I'm not going to go into all of those, but this slide isn't dealing with those. This slide only deals with projects that are outside their jurisdictional area, or if they're in the jurisdictional area, they might be exempt. And you have two options to go forward with those two types of projects, with those types of projects. You can either just go ahead and do it, somewhat at your own risk, but if you're truly outside the jurisdictional areas and not one of those special projects, or if your project is exempt, there's nothing requiring you to come into us to get an authorization for that. But sometimes you either want confirmation in writing, or a town or city is requiring you to get that in writing. You can submit a request for a regulatory applicability. That application is going to get you what you need. And when we get that application, we're going to get back to you and say, either confirm that no permit is required and you can go ahead, or we're going to say, well, no, you got something wrong. You actually do need a permit, or something is odd about this site. You do need to file an application for freshwater wetlands permit. And sometimes, and this happens occasionally, we'll get a proposal. We just can't figure out what the applicant really wants to do. We're just going to go back to them and say, sorry, you didn't give us enough information to give us an answer. Those are the types of things that you're going to get if you submit an application for regulatory applicability. If you are not exempt, which is this next slide, then perhaps there is, you might be able to get a general permit for that project. And that's kind of what this slide says. So you go ahead and you determine what your river protection region is. You go ahead and determine what your jurisdictional areas are and your buffer zone is, all the stuff that we talked about in our last workshop. And then you look at our general permit, which is not out there yet, but be patient. When it's out there, you can look at it and say, maybe my project is eligible for a general permit. And if it is, and if it meets other requirements, that is your next step. You submit an application for a general permit. We are trying to set it up to be a very quick and dirty process. And we're going to go back to you and say, either you're right, no permit. Actually, this slide is wrong. I should have caught that. We're going to say, go ahead. No, I was right. There are going to be times when people come in for an application for general permit, and we're going to look at it and say, they really don't need a permit for this because it happens that they're outside the jurisdictional area. Sometimes that happens. But otherwise, we're either going to tell you that you're authorized under that general permit, or that if you cannot be authorized under the general permit, we're going to give the applicant the option to convert that to an application for freshwater wetlands permit and proceed under that application, which is, coincidentally, the next slide. So if you're not eligible for a general permit, you get into the application for freshwater wetlands permit. And like I said, there are two flavors for that application for freshwater wetlands permit. Either you meet all the standards, in which case you're going to get a permit, or you don't meet all the standards, but you show that you are going, how you meet the variance requirements, and we will either issue a permit and grant those variances, or just like under the current process, we may determine that it's going to be a significant alteration, and you'll need to submit an application for a significant alteration, which is my last flow chart. Which I think is kind of ironic, right? The application for significant alteration probably is the most complicated application process we have under the freshwater wetlands program, yet here it is, the simplest flow chart I have for you today. So if it's a significant alteration, you submit that application for a significant alteration. And I should say here, in making the determination for whether a project is a significant alteration or not, we are operating under the same criteria that we have always operated under. If you look at the rules and look under the criteria for what is determined to be a significant alteration, with a few minor tweaks, it's pretty much the same thing. So very familiar to those of you who have worked with the program for a long time. Once you go through that whole process, including the initial review to make sure it's complete, public notice, detailed evaluation, you're going to come out of that with either a permit with a variance granted or a denial, either one of which is going to be able to be appealed, just like you have under the other rules. I did want to go over another change that has happened in the rules related to permits, and that is some of the expirations and renewal issues. We did change these up a little bit. So this slide kind of goes over what those are. So for an application for freshwater wetlands permit, if you get a permit under that application, that is going to be good for 5 years. And you'll be able to renew it for one additional 1 year renewal if you meet the criteria to get a renewal. That is a change from the current rules, which say your permit is good for 4 years and you get 1 year for an additional 2 year renewal. So just really a change in how good the initial permit is good for, but not really a change in the total length of time that you could potentially have a valid permit. And I should also mention here that you cannot renew a permit if it was issued under a joint freshwater wetlands ALTS application, which is not a change from our current rules and regulations.
And Chuck, if I can just jump in here, please, just because there is a difference in our equivalent section of the CRMC rules.
That's a good point.
In terms of permits. And here's one of these administrative differences because of the CRMC management procedures. As we presently do, we would issue a freshwater wetlands permit for a period of 3 years. So from the date the permit is issued, you have a 3-year period to complete that project, consistent with our management procedures. You can then apply for a renewal, which is good for a one-year renewal, provided you apply in advance of the expiration of your permit. You can apply for 3 administrative 1-year successive renewals. Your 4th 1-year renewal automatically goes before our council for approval. So that is a difference between the CRMC and DEM freshwater wetland rules with respect to permit renewals and their period of
Right.
Yeah.
Good to know. So for permits which we issue under applications for significant alteration, they are good for 1 year, which is not a change. All of our permits, like formal application permits, are good for a year. What has changed is you can only renew that up to 3 times total for a total of 4 years. We did remove the provision that is in our current rules to allow a 4th and final renewal for significant alterations. So that option is no longer available under the rules, which brings us right into alignment with the Freshwater Wetlands Act, which never mentioned anything about a 4th renewal. And the final change for time periods in applicability is this: if you're going to get a determination of the presence of jurisdictional area, boy, that word is hard to say sometimes, or if you get a verification of your wetland edge, either of those determinations is good for 5 years. Cannot be renewed. They never could be renewed. But that's an increase in 1 year over our current rules and regulations. So before I go into the next bit of slides regarding submittal requirements and application content, I'm going to pause here again to see if we have any unanswered questions that we need to address now.
Hi, Chuck. We don't have any questions in right now, so maybe you want to move along and.
Well, let's give it a minute. Maybe people are like, "Oh, here's my opportunity to ask a question." We'll see if anybody types anything in. So if we don't get anything in the next minute or so, we'll start talking about the. We're on the home stretch here, so we're doing good, I think, for time too as well. So it's not going to take me long to go over the next few bit of slides.
Someone asked if you could bring your previous slide back up while we wait.
Let's see, that would be the permanent expirations.
All right, we got one in that says, if a permit is issued under the current regulations, do the extension periods under the upcoming regulations apply?
Good question. So yes. So if you get a permit under the current regulations, let me think about that.
I'll answer.
I think that we would operate under the rules that were in effect at the time.
That is correct. That is correct. If someone receives a permit today or is about to receive a permit under the rules in effect prior to July 1 of this year, the permit is only good for the period specified within the current rules. And the new rules and these expiration dates would not apply until a permit is issued under the new rules.
Right.
And so you'd be filing on July 1st or thereafter.
Right. All right. Anything else, Sarah?
Nope, not right now.
All right. So let's move on. And any other questions that come in, we'll attack at the end. I am almost done here. So as far as submittal requirements for any of these applications go, nothing much is going, well, obviously, we're going to change our application forms. And that's something that we will communicate as that happens going forward. And we're hoping to have those in place and available to look at least by sometime in May. But all applications are going to need a form, a signature, fees, site plans. There's going to be freshwater wetland edge delineation related requirements, some of which are going to change. Additional site work requirements, none of that is really going to change. You're still going to have to do similar site work. And we have the same requirements for fees and professionals. But site plans here is highlighted because that is an area where some changes might end up having to occur. So you can imagine that when you're coming in for a project, we need site plans which are going to depict all of the freshwater wetland edges, the buffer zones, the buffers, and the jurisdictional areas. And this kind of highlights, how that needs to be shown. So you need to show the edge of the wetland, you need to show the edge and direction of flow of the river, or in areas of the storm flowage. You'll be showing the outer extent of any applicable buffer zone, which is a new thing. Although that's analogous to the permanent wetland or riverbank wetland that you're currently showing on your site plans. And you need to show the outer extent of the jurisdictional area, assuming that the jurisdictional area doesn't extend off your lot, which sometimes happens. So how that's going to kind of look, and I'm going to bring back a slide from my previous workshop. So if this was a site plan for a proposed project, so let's imagine like in this area of existing buildings and paved area, you're going to have a proposed project. So you're going to show the edge of the wetland, which is the same as what you do now. You're going to show the edge of the buffer zone, whatever that buffer zone has designated to be. And assuming that the buffer zone hasn't extended all the way to the limit of the jurisdictional area edge, you'll also show a separate jurisdictional area edge line, which is this outer dotted line. The toughest thing to show is the buffer, the limit of buffer. How do you show what that limit of buffer is? And what we're suggesting is basically, it's no different than kind of showing the edge of existing developed area. And we get this a lot on proposed projects, especially for projects adjacent to wetlands, where some of the wetland area has already been developed. Sometimes they'll call it a proposed, an existing tree line or existing area of clearing. It'll be a little bit more important that an applicant show those developed portions of their lot on the site plans. Because when we look at a site plan, we're going to see the edge of the buffer zone, right? Because you have to show that. And we're going to see the existing features of that lot, whether they be existing buildings, existing pavement, all that area that's maybe in this gray area in this slide here. And anything that's not developed, that's in the buffer zone, we're going to consider to be buffer. That's really the simplest way to do it. So we're going to be looking for site plans to be a little bit more precise in what the limits of the existing developed area is. So existing buildings, existing pavement, existing lawn or landscaped area, gravel areas. Show the limits of those on your site plan. And that's going to, by process of elimination, so to speak, tell us what is buffer on that lot. In many cases, it's all going to be buffer, right? There's not going to be any developed feature within that buffer zone. But for cases where it does encroach into buffer zone, then it's going to be important to show those developed features. And then we have floodplain, which we don't want to forget that, right? That's a jurisdictional area. And if there is floodplain, you need to show that on the plans. And particularly where that area extends beyond the jurisdictional area, which it happens sometimes in the larger rivers. So, but that's an elevation, right? That's an elevation. You have to survey that on, and you have to show that elevation, what that floodplain elevation is on your site plans. There are a couple exceptions to that, or we may grant an exception to that requirement when the predetermined 100-year flood elevation is not available from a public source, and when a registered professional engineer provides us clear and convincing evidence that the project, it says project site, it should be proposed project, is above any probable 100-year floodplain. And you do that either by a detailed engineering study or by showing us that worst case scenario, the flood cannot back up beyond a particular elevation and all of your project is above that elevation. This is not a change. This is all the same site plan requirements and exception that we have under our current rules and regulations. So for each of the application types, particularly the application for freshwater wetlands permit and the application for significant alteration, there are a couple new things that are going to come into play with the new rules. So the first thing is we will ask some documentation of how each of the standard has been met. It's not going to be like a standalone document because each standard has a different way of documenting how you meet it, right? If you're going to need to meet a stormwater requirement, you'll provide us the stormwater documents, the stormwater calculations in order to show how you've met that stormwater standard. Meeting the buffer standard, it's easy. You show on the site plan that you stayed out of the buffer. That's how you meet that standard. For a application for freshwater wetland permit, you only need to provide an avoidance and minimization narrative and the other variance requirements only when all of the standards cannot be met. And if you can't meet them all, then you do need to provide that. And again, it's going to be aimed at whatever the particular standard is that you cannot meet. And this third bullet is another change, and that's in the rules and regulations. And this is going to be probably the subject of future training, at least with the municipalities. For major land development projects or major subdivisions, which are defined in statute under the, I can't remember what the name of the statute is, but it's basically the main state zoning statute that all the cities and towns abide by. For these types of projects, then you will need to be providing some kind of documentation from the local level prior to the application to DEM. So you need to go at least through master plan, for example, for a major subdivision or a major project with the town and get that done before you come to the DEM. And we'll be asking for documentation that you've done that. It's a little bit more detailed than that. I will direct you to this rule, this 3.11.2A4 for exactly what those requirements are. And when you're talking and going into the application for a significant alteration, same kinds of things. You need to show how each standard has been met, which is a new requirement because this is new for us. We've never had standards. You need to meet the avoidance and minimization requirement. That's always going to be the case for a formal application. And again, we have this same requirement in here for major land development projects or major subdivisions. And that is what I have for tonight. There is a link on this slide here that brings you to that wetland page that Sean talked about earlier, where you can review this recording, because we are recording this training today. Previous recordings, you'll be able to get access to slides, as well as other interesting training materials that are specific to the wetlands rules. So with the time we have remaining.
Yes, Thank you, Chuck. We actually do have a couple of questions that came in, so Sarah, can you please highlight those for Chuck?
Sure. The first question, will signatures still need to be originals?
For now, yes. We are very slowly working towards having eventually an e-permitting platform where we will no longer be able to, no longer have to have those original ink signatures. We do recognize that that's the way to go. We're just not there yet. It takes time, it takes money. We're really looking to update all of our permitting processes here that will allow us to do that. But for now, yeah, we'll still need those original ink signatures.
Okay. Next, could you please reiterate the need to submit an application when in the jurisdictional area, but clearly out of the buffer zone?
Yeah, so under the statute and under the rules and regulations that we're putting into effect, what it basically says is that if you are proposing a project within the jurisdictional area that has been established, and jurisdictional area encompasses everything, including wetlands and buffer zones. But for this purpose, we're talking about the jurisdictional area limit, that 100 feet from any freshwater wetland, regardless of type or size, or within 200 feet of any river or stream or public water supply reservoir, regardless of size or width or anything like that. What it basically says is if you're in that area, you need to get a permit, unless you are exempt from the need to get a permit. And we have a whole laundry list of exemptions of projects that can go forward in the jurisdictional area without a permit. For certain projects that are within the jurisdictional area but are outside that buffer zone, we are hoping to develop a general permit to more efficiently permit those. Because if you are out of that buffer zone, then we know that you meet the freshwater wetland standard. We know that you meet the buffer standard. I'm assuming that you can meet the setback standard. Then it's just a matter of meeting all of the other standards, which you've always had to meet. And if you can demonstrate that you meet all of those, you should be able to get coverage under the general permit that we are hoping to propose very shortly after these rules go into effect.
Thanks, Chuck. Who determines if a project is a major land development project, the town or RIDEM?
Neither, neither, right?
Well,
Jim?
yeah, so
law.
the answer there is that major land use development is defined in Rhode Island General Laws, Chapter 45, Title 45, Chapter 23. And so DEM doesn't define it, CRMC doesn't define it. It is defined in statute. And if it meets the statutory definition and has to go through the subdivision of land, major development, minor development process through the local municipality, it's under that process where DEM or CRMC would have some input during the master plan review at the local level. And that's defined in that Title 45, Chapter 23.
And I would mention here, and I'm sure this is going to come up at some point in the future as well, during that initial zoning process, applicants also need to be aware that they need to be going forward with a project and a proposal that isn't painting them into the corner of needing a variance. Because then it becomes an action of an applicant that forced them to have to come in for a variance that they could have avoided if they had kept that into mind designing the project in the first place. So that's the kind of thing that might actually come up ahead of time before we even see the project during that municipal review process. So go ahead, Sarah. Anything else?
We just had one more come in, asking for clarification. If a application is submitted that proposes a project under the current freshwater regulations, will we need to reapply after the new regulations go into effect?
The short answer is no. If someone applies today, the rules in effect today apply to that project. The new rules will only apply to projects where an application is filed July 1st or later when the new rules come into effect.
And there are going to be some provisions, kind of a grace period after those rules go into effect for a limited amount of time and for a limited list of projects that, for example, already have gone through master plan approval at the local level. So yeah, if you're submitting on June 30th, the current rules will apply to your project going forward. If you apply on July 1st, the new rules will apply, unless you meet one of those exceptions that's within, I'm gonna forget the name of that rule. But it's in the rules and regulations of where those exceptions are.
That's in the superseded rules section, Chuck.
That's the one, the superseded rules. This is why we're a team.
Well, it looks like we have answered most of the questions at this point, and I just want to say that we have captured these questions, and these questions will be, what we intend to do is post the question and answer fact sheet for each of our workshops. So we're just about to wrap up our fact sheet for the January 26th workshop, and that should be posted shortly. And then we will also capture these and provide a fact sheet for the February 28th workshop and post that as well. So if we did not answer your question or somehow missed it, we will capture it in that response. And if you have any follow-up questions to this or to our responses, please submit those through our question and answer form or online form that's posted on our webpage. That actually is the easiest way for us to keep track of the questions that come in. And we will make sure that we get back to you with a specific answer. So much appreciate that. And again, remind you to take this opportunity to grab the survey, link to the survey form, and give us, most importantly, your thoughts on additional training topics and needs so that we can tailor the next few workshops to meet those needs. Much appreciated. We're going to be planning, as Chuck mentioned, we're going to be planning some additional training beyond. So we have one scheduled for March 30th, and we're going to be talking about exemptions and municipal coordination, as well as maybe a few other things. That agenda should be finalized and posted to our website along with the registration link, probably by I would say mid-March at least. So you can look for that. We also will send you a reminder. Anybody who's attended the first or second workshop, we have information from the registration. We'll send you a reminder that it's up and posted. You can look for it there. But after that March 30th workshop, we will have additional workshops just on the application materials, process, and application preparation questions. And as well as while we're working on our general permit, which will come out subsequent to that. And sometime in June, we'll be having some stakeholder workshops before we go out to our formal process in starting July 1st. So with that said, I appreciate the questions and the interest in these workshops. Again, another great turnout. Again, use the survey to give us feedback to make sure that we tailor it to meet your needs. And again, I want to thank all the presenters today for the work, and Chuck, and especially Sarah and Sean for helping us pull all this together, either through organizing us around the Zoom tool or helping us with the content. So appreciate it very much. I just want to say thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.